very much. To build on everything that Darren has just said, I'm going to give an overview of some of the work Seafish has carried out over the last year on employment in both the fleet and the processing sector. Have the benefit of, unlike most talks today, nothing I say will change because the hard data will stay exactly the same, so I at least have that. So I'll start with, or attempt to start, with the fleet. So I'll be presenting some of the data from our 2018 Fleet Employment Survey. So this work started with a pilot survey carried out by Seafish in 2017, and off of the back of the success of that survey, in 2018 the employment questions were actually included in our annual fleet survey. Many of you in the room today have been involved in that work in one way or another. So this was a survey of, we collected data for 730 people employed in the fleet across 291 vessels, and this is across the UK. So all the data I'll present is UK-wide rather than Scotland-specific. And I should say on this, for the fleet survey, the data is presented for the sample we collected and is not representative of the wider fleet. We've not made estimates for the fleet, taking into account the variety of vessels that are actually in the UK fleet. To start with, around half of the sample were people employed in vessels based in Scotland. And you can see from this figure that 79% of workers in that sample on Scottish vessels were from the UK. The remaining 7% being from other EU countries, and 14% being from non-EU countries, primarily from the Philippines and some from Ghana, through the transit visa system that Darren mentioned earlier in his talk. As you may have expected, the highest proportion of EU staff was found in the Northern Irish sample. So we collected this data by the position each worker held on the vessel. As you can see from this figure, 99% of skippers in the sample were British. If you compare that to deckhands, just under a third were from other EU countries or from non-EU countries. And if we look at engineers, almost a quarter were from non-EU countries, again, primarily from the Philippines. As you might expect, given the restrictions on where these people can work, the larger vessels using mobile gears who are working outside of the 12 nautical mile limit are more likely to employ a higher proportion of non-UK workers than smaller vessels that might be working inside the 12-mile limit. So for the demersal trawlers over 18 metres, you have about 37% of the sample were from other EU or from non-EU countries, and around a third of the crew members on Nephrops trawlers. Again, this is indicative of the system in which we work and the types of vessels that are able to use these transit visa systems. One comment we often hear on the fleet survey is lamenting the lack of youngsters that are entering the industry, and it comes up time and time again, and I think the data that we've collected proves that, with skippers having the highest average age in the sample at 48 years old, the youngest being deckhands, which had an average age of 35 years old. Overall, for the entire sample, the average age of workers employed in the fleet was 42 years old. So I think there's certainly something to be said there for the lack of young people who are entering the industry and working their way up from deckhand through to skipper. So the 2018 employment data for the fleet has actually already been published. Some of you may already have seen it. The full report has a lot more information on work patterns, on qualifications of staff, and also on types of remuneration in the fleet. And if you have an interest in that, I would encourage you to have a look, or if you've not seen it, speak to me during the break or after the session today, and we'll make sure we get you a copy of the report. It's also available on the Seafish website if you'd like to download it and have a look. So that was just a flying visit across the fleet employment data, and now I'll talk a little bit about the processing sector labour research that we've carried out over the last year and a half. This work is part funded by DEFRA and came about in response to anecdotal reports from the processing sector that the labour pool was tightening and recruitment was becoming more difficult. We actually started the project in Aberdeen with the project design meeting, in which some of you here today were at the meeting then to decide what we actually needed to do, what we wanted to collect and what we wanted to present. The project is split into two distinct parts, the first of which is an annual survey on workforce composition. So we collect data on people employed in the seafood processing sector over the last 12-month period, and we collect data on their age, their job skill level, their contract type, and a few other factors. And we also carry out a quarterly survey on ease of recruitment, where we collect data on processors' perceived ease of recruitment, how companies would look to adapt if they can't recruit enough staff, and business confidence in recruiting and retaining enough staff over the next quarter. There's a series of these reports already on the Seafish site, so if you have an interest, there's already a lot of data there. Again, I'm sure some of you have seen this already, but I would encourage you to have a look. But the data I'm presenting today hasn't actually been published yet, so hot off the press, and it's just a top-level view of what we've collected specific to Scotland. The final report will obviously have a lot more information, and we're expecting that to be published in April. The annual survey, the second annual survey, was carried out in December 2018. We collected data for just under 11,000 people employed in the processing sector in 2018, and around 7,000 of those were employed in Scotland. So we had a fantastic response from processors in Scotland. Despite the changing political landscape that we always talk about, the processing sector remains heavily reliant on non-UK workers. This figure shows data for the entire sample, so the entire 11,000 workers in the sample, 48% of whom were from the UK, 51% of whom were from other EU countries, and 1% were from third countries. The 51% from other EU countries, primarily from what we would term the A8 or A2 countries, so Poland, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria. Now to look at that specific to Scotland and how we compare to the other home nations. So as you can see from this figure, Scotland, the processors in the sample from Scotland employed the highest proportion of non-UK workers. So around 40% of the sample of 7,000 workers were from the UK, compared to around 60% who were not, 59% of whom were European. So this reliance on European workers comes through consistently in the data. To delve into that data a little bit deeper, we can look at it by region of the UK. So I've highlighted here the regions of Scotland. What's important to say here as well is that of the sample from Scotland, around half were based in Grampian. We generally look at Grampian and compare it against Humber, being the two key seafood processing hubs in the UK. To put things in perspective, the Grampian region employed 70% non-UK workers, the sample from the Grampian region in 2018 was around 70% non-UK workers, which is more than twice the proportion of non-UK workers in the sample from Humber. And indeed, the Grampian region did employ the highest proportion of non-UK workers of any region in the sample. This can be attributed to a range of factors, but the ones we hear most often are low levels of local unemployment, and the most recent ONS data had a figure of 3.7% unemployment for the Grampian region, which is very low compared to other regions of the UK. And also negative perceptions of the industry, meaning that a lot of local people don't want to work in fish processing. And this is something that's came out consistently through our processing sector labour work. We also look at the data by processing site size. So here we've banded sites by the number of FTE jobs they supported in 2018. So from the left of the figure here, the 1 to 10s, the smallest sites, up to the right-hand side, the 100 plus FTE sites, the largest sites in the industry. And there's a really clear trend here that comes out in the data of, as site size increases, the proportion of UK staff decreases. So from the smallest sites in the sample, at which 82% of workers were from the UK, down to the 100 plus FTE sites, in which 46% of the sample, of workers in the sample, were from the UK. What's important to remember here is that these are proportions. Whilst the sites in the 1 to 10 FTE size band account for 44% of sites in the UK, they only supported 4% of FTE jobs in the sector in 2018. Conversely, the largest sites in the 100 plus FTE size band made up 13% of sites in the UK in 2018, but supported almost 70% of FTE jobs. That's why when we have this difference here, you can see from the overall figure of 51% EU staff, that's where this comes from, the difference in weighting of different size sites. Something that we cannot avoid in the discussion is the job skill level. And Darren mentioned this already. It's a key metric that's always taken into account in migration policy. And if you've read the white paper, you'll see that it does specify differences in job skill level and how they'll be treated, or how they intend to be treated under future immigration policy. So we collected data on job skill level for around 9,000 of the sample, 9,000 workers in the sample. And this data, again, is specific to Scotland. So we go from high-skilled roles at the top of the diagram, and then working clockwise through to the lower-skilled roles. The high-skilled roles here in question are what we would term RQF 6+, so what would qualify for the Tier 2 system, the high-skilled allowances for immigration. And this decreases as we go around the diagram. In the sample from Scotland, 96% of the high-skilled roles were held by UK staff. And this proportion decreases as job skill level decreases, to the point where at semi-skilled, which is RQF 3, the proportion of EU staff actually overtakes the proportion of UK staff in the sample. And to the point where, by the time we reach low skill, 60% of the workers in the sample were from the EU, and in the unskilled roles in the sample, 77% were from the EU. Now, this is really important because, as I said, this always enters the discussion about immigration. As things stand, these roles would not have qualified for the Tier 2 system. The people employed in these roles would not have been able to come to the UK under that system. And this is something that needs to be taken into consideration for future immigration policy. What that will actually look like when the dust is settled is not for me to say, but it's something that needs to be kept in mind. So as I said, the processing sector data isn't actually published at the moment, but we will be getting that published in April. So if that is something that you're interested in, I'd encourage you first to have a look at the series of reports that is already available on the website. And if you're interested, please grab me at some point during lunch or after the session, and I will make sure that you receive a copy of the report as soon as that's approved and published. And I think that's me. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and if anyone has any questions, again, feel free to catch me after the session or during the Q&A session after the next talk. Thank you very much.